Hi, it's Laura at Aquamarine18. Thanks for stopping by my channel today. Welcome or welcome back. This is the first part of a two-part end of month recap for April 2021. As it turns out, I've finished 13 books in April. So I thought that they would be best put in their own video, which will be this video, as opposed to just inside the monthly recap as usual, because I don't want the videos to be very, very, very long. So this is just going to be a recap of the reading I've been doing over the course of April. I don't normally have 13 books to talk about, but I did finish 13 books this month. I don't actually think I read any more this month than I do usually per se, like in terms of hours reading or amount of words read per se, but I did read a number of books that were quite short. I also finished some books that I had been kind of reading over a longer term during April. So it just so happened that I've ended up with this large number of books that month. So that's the context for that. I'm going to timestamp the books that I've read below. I'm actually only going to talk about 12 of the 13. The 13th one was the Tarot Correspondences by T. Susan Chang, which is a reread for me, but I've posted a detailed review of this book on my channel, so you can see my thoughts there. Before I get into talking about the other 12 books, which some of them I have lots to say about, I wanted to start though by bringing folks' attention to an important campaign that's happening right now called Dear Publishers. You may have seen this if you're on Instagram, because they have the Instagram profile called Dear Publishers. They also have their website, dearpublishers.com. I'm going to link it below. And in the words of their website, Dear Publishers is a community of bookstagrammers, readers, authors, influencers, and educators demanding that publishers address their racist policies and practices. So this is a campaign that goes to publishers demanding change. And there's lots of ways to get involved. And as the campaign unfolds, new different action items are being released as it goes along, and there's opportunity to give feedback on the direction of the campaign and so on. Right now, if you check out the website, you'll find some petitions that you can sign. You will find a template for some letter sending and email form, and a set of demands around addressing racism in publishing. And I've talked before about reading diversely, about supporting and demonstrating the desire for and the need for books by diverse authors in all genres. But this campaign, very importantly, goes further than that, right? Because institutionalized racism in publishing is not just about who gets published and who doesn't, though certainly that is an important part of it for sure. But the demands that the campaign has articulated also include, for example, attention to who is represented in the publishing workforce, right? How diverse are the staffs and editorial teams of publishers? This matters. And so the campaign is asking for transparency on that in terms of annual reporting, for example. It also speaks to issues like which books are most promoted, which books or authors get the biggest marketing budgets put towards promoting their books, as well as, for example, the need for action plans with clear kind of benchmarked short-term and long-term goals in terms of inclusivity and diversity and anti-racism in publishing. So it's a really multifaceted campaign that I think is really, really important. And, I think that reading mindfully comes into play here, right? When we spend money on books, when we choose to read particular books, which inevitably means we're not reading other books, these are decisions, right? And when I'm sharing books or assigning books to students as an instructor, this matters too. And so I'm thinking a lot about that and supporting that campaign. And I would encourage you, particularly if you haven't already, to definitely check out dearpublishers.com, learn more about the issues and speak up about the need to address racism in publishing. So important. So, with that, the first book that I actually want to talk about in my, it's not actually a stack of 12 books. I read a lot of ebooks this month. It's actually a stack of 3 books and then a bunch of books that I don't have physical copies of. But the first book that I want to talk about that I read in April of 2021 is a book that focuses on racism. And it's a book called White Tears, Brown Scars, How White Feminism Betrays Women of Color by Ruby Hamad. And I learned of this book from Queen Osset. So thank you, Queen Osset, for showing the cover of this book in a video on your channel, because when I saw it, I looked it up and I got it, and I'm really glad that I read this book. This book, I would say, and I said this in the review that I wrote of this book, is one of the best contemporary anti-racist feminist texts that I have read in quite some time, and I have read quite a few. I teach contemporary feminisms, I teach feminist theory. This is a book that I can assign at least excerpts of or chapters of to my students, and it's current, and it's really well researched. It has a great bibliography, endnotes, lots of ideas for further reading here, which is fantastic. It includes attention to history, to contemporary politics, to pop culture and like representation in pop culture, racist, sexist tropes of representation in pop culture, for example, social movements like feminist movements and historically predominantly white feminist movements, complete failures when it comes to intersectionality and inclusiveness. Mass media, right, and the ways that mass media perpetuate racist and sexist thinking, and much more than that. A lot of really important arguments are covered in this book. I wrote in my review of this book as well that I think that Hamad provides really useful terminology and concepts. In particular, she gives us in this book the concept strategic white womanhood, and I'm just looking at a document because I've written down a quote here. That is a term, strategic white womanhood, that can help to name and disrupt the ways that white feminists strategically draw upon a performance of womanhood that is designed to empower the white woman at the expense of women of color for the benefit of white society. That's a quote from page 124 about defining the concept of strategic white womanhood. And I think that this is really readable, really approachable. You don't need a huge background in feminist history or anything like that to read this book. And I would really highly recommend it. There are just so many good insights packed into this book, and it's not even that long. It's 250 pages plus a bibliography. So good. She talks about, just as an example, I found the way that she talked about the huge percentage of white women who voted for Donald Trump and the reasons for that. I found the way that she discussed that to be so on point in ways that I found a lot of the discussion of that to be lacking. That's just one example of a lot of other topics that are covered in this book. So this one I gave 5 stars. Absolutely recommend it, 100%. And thank you again to Queen Osset for showing this book in a video, because that's how I found it, and I'm really glad that I read it because I've been giving it to people, and suggesting it to people since I did. I think it's really excellent. The next book that I want to talk about I chose because of one of my TBR cards. I've been drawing some of these TBR cards each month. These are made by Jessie of Bow Ties and Books on YouTube and Instagram. You can get these decks of cards on, I think they're on Etsy. I've shown them before. I have a video about these. But I've been picking a few for each month. And one of the cards that I picked for April is Discovery. And it says, from library, find a book you've never read. And then the sign says books you've never heard of. Now for this book, I didn't go to the library. I went to the bookstore. And the reason for that is because the library here is closed. We are in a stay-at-home order. Almost everything is closed right now. It has been for weeks. You cannot go to the library and browse. So I did go to the bookstore because at the time the bookstore was open. And I decided to just pick a book that I had never heard of and read it. And the book that I found was A History of My Brief Body by Billy Ray Belcourt. And this book is a memoir written by a queer Indigenous author who is a poet. Let's get his about the author bit here. Billy Ray Belcourt is a writer and scholar from the Driftpile Cree Nation who won the 2018 Griffin Poetry Prize for his debut collection, has been a recipient of a Rhodes Scholarship, Inspire Award, and is a professor. And so I'd never heard of this book, but the thing that caught my eye about this book is what it says on the back. To love someone is firstly to confess I'm prepared to be devastated by you. And when I picked this book up, it was like this book needed to come home with me. I wasn't familiar with Billy Ray Belcourt's work. I am not someone who reads a ton of poetry, which is what he had published previously or has published previously. But I was really keen to read this memoir. I gave this book 5 stars. It's short, but every turn of phrase in this book is beautiful. It is incisive. It is poetic, and and a memoir and a political critique, and it's a really, really powerful read. And I'm going to be seeking out some of his work for sure. And I just thought I'd share something that I really liked that he said to give a sense of some of the things I like about this book. So he talks about discovering that Michel Foucault, a political thinker, who I have pretty much a whole shelf dedicated to, it's that shelf right there, that Michel Foucault is a Libra and that he's also a Libra, and he says, he's been at times ambivalent and others hostile to the astrological renaissance at the core of contemporary queer life, but finding out that Foucault was a Libra mattered to him. And some of what he had thought about astrology is in here, but something he says that just I underlined and I put a heart beside. He says, the theorists who excite me the most are, in a sense, speculative fiction writers. What's missing or fleeting in the world is evidence of other ways of being, of something dawning. So the onus isn't to observe a phenomenon as it happens, but to chase after a hunch or a half-formed hypothesis that might accumulate into an artifact of a future history. Their keywords include possibility, utopia, futurity, hope, and optimism. And I really liked that. And I really enjoyed this book. So, 5 stars. History of My Brief Body by Billy Ray Belcourt. The third book that I want to talk about was also inspired by a TBR card. I got 4 of these for last month, and I picked 4 different books. Page to Screen, a book that has been adapted to screen. And this book was already on my to-read list and just happened to satisfy that prompt. And that book is Maurice by E.M. Forster. This book was completed in 1914. But it wasn't published until after the author, Forster, died in 1970. And part of that had to do with the novel featuring a gay protagonist, and, concerns about the book's publishability, concerns about what that would do, to the author's career, perhaps safety. And so it wasn't published until the 1970, but it was finished in 1914, and it takes place in the early 1900s in England. And I had never read this before, and I haven't yet seen the film, but this was adapted into a film, hence the stage and screen, in, I think, the late 80s is when the film was made. But I'm actively looking for the film. I know I can find it. Like, it was, I think, a very well-received, critically acclaimed film. I know I'll be able to find it. I just haven't found it yet. This book affected me more than I expected it to. And the back of the book describes it as compellingly honest and beautifully written. It offers a powerful condemnation of the repressive attitudes of British society, and is at once a moving love story and an intimate tale of one man's erotic and political self-discovery. And so that is the account of the book. It's very much, I would say, more character-based than plot-based, for sure. In some ways, there's not a ton of plot. It's much more about the characters. But I wanted to share something that hit me when I was reading this. There's something at the back of the book called the terminal note, and this was written by the author in 1960. So at that point, this book is still unpublished, but he writes this note to be included with the end of the book when it is published. And this is a spoiler. So if you don't want to hear the end, again, it's not really a plot-driven book, but if you don't want to hear the end, click ahead to the next book. So the spoiler is that the book has a happy ending, and that was emotional in a way. And in the terminal note, the author, E.M. Forster, writes, "A happy ending was imperative. I shouldn't have bothered to write otherwise. I was determined that in fiction, anyway, two men should fall in love and remain in it for the ever and ever that fiction allows." And then he goes on to say that the fact that the book ends happily for the character made the book more difficult to publish. Because if something bad had happened to the gay protagonist or to his lover in the book, then it would have kind of had a lesson that it wasn't okay. But because it ends happily, it doesn't. He says the lovers get away unpunished and consequently recommend crime. And so at the time, it wouldn't have been publishable. And that is, like, thinking about representation in literature or representation in general, something, that's really something. So the rest of the books are ebooks, so I don't actually have anything physical to show you, but I know them all, and I have my little list here of what I read. So continuing on with the TBR cards, I also got this one called Fresh Meat, a trope you haven't read before. And I learned about this diagram here that's on the picture when I started looking up tropes, because I'm like, what is a trope that I haven't read before? This is a bingo card, and there's different trope bingo cards that you can find online for different genres or different reading challenges. So that's what that is representing. And it's really hard to kind of come up with a trope and then find a book that has it in it as a way of finding a book, because you kind of need to know everything that's in a book to know what trope is there, if that makes sense. So this was a bit of a challenge for me. But what I decided to do was to get a romance book, because I don't read romance books for the most part. I've read a few that I really loved, but I thought I would go with one that was clearly going to contain some tropes that I had never read before, because romance writing is full of different tropes and I just don't read a lot of it. So I picked Winter's Orbit by Everina Maxwell. It's a new release, and I will not lie that part of the reason that I picked it was that if you pre-ordered it and put your name in that you pre-ordered it, you could get a pin. And I feel that this pin, and it has sparkles. I feel that this pin is perfect for me. So, so I got that. And Winter's Orbit, I don't want to say too much to give away the plot. I was a bit disappointed in it because it was compared to a series of books in the book Ancillary Justice by Anne Leckie that I really, really loved, and I thought that Winter's Orbit was not like it at all. Winter's Orbit by Everina Maxwell, I should have mentioned. Wasn't like it at all. There were quite a few things that I did like about Winter's Orbit, and it was certainly full of romance tropes, so it satisfied this card. I also had some issues with some of the representation in the book. In terms of it being a gay romance, it felt watered down to me in a lot of ways. And it took a long time for the plot to get started. However, I also did like the political intrigue in the book. It's if you couldn't tell by this, by this pin, it is a gay romance book, but it's also, it's a science fictional setting. And so it started off kind of slow. There's some interesting political intrigue in it. I would not compare it to Anne Leckie, but I'm glad I read it. And I got this cool pin. So that's a highlight of Winter's Orbit. Next, for the last one, and this is the only prompt I had a suggestion from a viewer for, so I did get a suggestion from a viewer for this, but I ended up reading something that I already owned. But if you're the person if you're watching this and you're the person who suggested me a book for this, that book is now on my to-read list, wish list as well, but I already had something to read for this that I already paid for. And so I got the Victor Laval card, which I hope you can see here, says horror/paranormal fiction with strong social themes. And so for this, I picked a book that I had already had on my Kindle, and that is Ring Shout by P. Djeli Clark. And P. Djeli Clark is one of a handful of authors writing right now that just, if he writes something, I'll buy it, because I think that his work is fantastic. And so I had Ring Shout sitting on my Kindle, and so I read it for this prompt. And Ring Shout is a horror novella. It is a novella that kind of falls into, what do I want to say? A category of works, we'll say, that have been taking up Lovecraftian elements of horror and monsters, from H.P. Lovecraft's work. H.P. Lovecraft was a racist, a horrifying racist. And so Ring Shout is one book among a number of books that have taken up elements of Lovecraftian style horror and monsters and turned them to anti-racist ends. So like Lovecraft Country is one. I haven't actually read Lovecraft Country, but there's the book and the television show that would fall into that group. Victor Laval has also written the kind of Lovecraftian anti-racist horror as well. And P. Djeli Clark's Ring Shout, which I read this month, also falls into that group. And I don't want to say again too much to spoil the plot, but to speak to basically what's in the book description. Part of the premise of the novella is that the racist propaganda film Birth of a Nation is a kind of magic spell that brings out evil into the world, or amplifies evil that is in the world. And so it follows a group of predominantly women, and P. Djeli Clark writes like fantastic female protagonists as well, I will say. Like, that's one of the many things that I like about his work. It follows a group of mostly women who are fighting these monsters. But it's very much, in terms of this strong social themes, it's very much an anti-racist book. And so it was scary. Given the subject matter, of course it was scary. It should be scary. But it was really excellent. I'm glad that I read it. It was scary, but really, really great. And P. Djeli Clark, again, is an author that I really love. And Ring Shout is nominated for a Hugo Award for Best Novella for this year. So that's really great. On that topic, part of why I was reading novellas and shorter books this month is because I wanted to read as many of the Hugo nominees as I could. So at this point, I've read all of the Hugo nominated novels for this year and most of the novellas, but not all. I haven't read 2. One of them I'm not sure if I'm going to get to because it's like 5th in a series and I haven't read the series, so I would have to read a lot of other things first. And I've read some of the series nominees, but not most. So that's kind of where I'm at. But I was happy to read Ring Shout, because I had already bought it and I've always planned to read it, but I just hadn't gotten to it yet. So having this horror paranormal fiction with a strong social theme was like the nudge I needed to read it, and really, really good. Really, really good. Really, really scary. The next one that I read was Upright Women Wanted, which is another novella. It's by Sarah Gailey, and they're also nominated for the Hugo for Best Novella. And Upright Women Wanted includes in the description of the book, the future American Southwest is full of bandits, fascists, and queer librarian spies on horseback trying to do the right thing. So clearly I was going to buy this. Queer anti-fascist librarians is just going to be a book that I get. So I read that one. It was a very quick read, again, a novella. I could read it in a day or two. There were some small parts of the plot that didn't really work for me, I will say. But overall, it was a good read, I thought. And if you like, it's a kind of Western, but certainly kind of turning the Western on its head in some ways as well, with, predominantly but not exclusively female cast, really kind of minimal world building that really worked. So something that's kind of interesting about Upright Women Wanted is that they don't really tell you in the book what kind of led to the American setting being like what it is at all. So it's clear that there's been some, collapse in various ways. It's clear that some forms of fuel that we're currently very reliant on are no longer available in this world, but it doesn't really tell you a lot about the setting. It's quite sparse in that way, but that also really worked. So it was an interesting one for sure. Upright Women Wanted by Sarah Gailey. The next one that I read that was also a Hugo nominee, and it was the last Hugo novel nominee for me to read, was Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. And Piranesi, I'm going to say basically nothing about the plot of this because it's the kind of book that is best gone into with no information whatsoever. It's weird and mysterious and unusual. It's very hard to even compare it to anything. The closest thing that kind of comes to mind would be something like This Census Taker by China Miéville, but This Census Taker is much more horror. Piranesi is fantasy for sure. Very, very strange little book. And I liked a lot about Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. However, however, and this is another slight spoiler, not a huge plot spoiler, but a slight spoiler, so if you don't want it, skip. Piranesi suffers from the queer-coded villain problem. And not even coded, because the one character in the book whose sexuality is in any way specified, who is a character who is represented as gay or perhaps bisexual, but a man who is interested in other men anyway, is talked about in such a way as to suggest that his being gay is related to his being a sociopathic killer. No. This representation has a very long and not good history to it. Queer coding villains is something that has happened in many films and books. You can find entire YouTube videos explaining what, queer-coded villains are and what the problems are associated with that. But suffice to say that in the book, Piranesi by Susanna Clarke, this villain is repeatedly described in ways like, he's transgressive in so many ways, like in terms of his sexuality and his being a criminal, and it's like, no. So I really loved a lot about this book. I was immediately sucked in terms of, the plot and wanting to know what was going to happen and wanting to figure out what was happening, because it was very, it left a lot unsaid for much of the book. It's written beautifully. There's so much, I think, that is great about Piranesi, but that representation really soured it for me. So I was not happy about that. The next book that I'll mention I got as a advanced reader copy, and it is The All-Consuming World by Cassandra Khaw. Cassandra Khaw is a debut author, so it's their first book. And I saw this book available for advanced reading on NetGalley and requested it and got it, and I was very happy with that. And I requested it in part because it's compared to a lot of authors that I really love, some of my favorite authors. And it was compared to works by Ursula Le Guin. I find that comparison totally baffling. I do not see any comparison to Ursula Le Guin with Cassandra Khaw's All-Consuming World. However, that is not a criticism. I just think they're very different. So it wasn't really what I 100% expected. If I was going to compare The All-Consuming World by Cassandra Khaw to something else in terms of, who I think would really like it, it would be if you really liked Gideon the Ninth by Tamsin Muir. It is more along those lines, I would say. It has horror elements, science fictional elements. It follows a group of cyborgs, and they, are going, banding together again. They have a long kind of history together, getting back together again for kind of one final task, we'll say. And it was good, actually. All-Consuming World was good. I would say that it's definitely a book that is, again, more about the language and more about the character development than the plot. The plot was not groundbreaking, I didn't think, but it was exciting enough to keep me interested. I don't want to say, again, too much about it because I feel like I'm always trying to avoid really bad plot spoilers. But, a crew of mostly women and non-binary cyborgs, fighting their way through this mission. It was immediately a book that when I saw it, I wanted to read, and I'm glad I did. I gave it a 4-star review. And if you're someone who is interested in or liked Tamsin Muir's Gideon the Ninth, then I think that you would definitely like The All-Consuming World by Cassandra Khaw. It was a good, exciting, little bit, not really horror, but like a little bit of those elements. Lots of good battle scenes and things. It was good. The All-Consuming World by Cassandra Khaw. Oh my goodness, I've been talking for half an hour. Okay. The next one it's good that I separated this out. The next one that I talked about was, the next one that I will talk about that I read is another advanced copy, so it's not out for availability yet, but I would say to definitely bookmark it and check it out when it is Goddess of the North. And Goddess of the North is by Georgina Kamsika. And it is a combination of urban fantasy police procedural. This is an interesting one. The main character is Sarah, and Sarah's like a really great character, and I have no idea if Georgina Kamsika, the author, plans on writing more books in this setting or with this protagonist, but if she did, I would buy it in a second. So in this book, different deities of all different kinds of pantheons from around the world are characters in this book, and Sarah is described in the book as kind of a minor, not very well-known goddess of the Hindu pantheon. and she has elected to, at least for the most part, live as though she was a human and amongst humans. And she, she is a goddess of order, and she works as a police detective. And so the story of Goddess of the North follows her investigating a crime with supernatural elements involved in it. But it also a lot covers her experiences as a woman of Southeast Asian descent, working in a very predominantly male, predominantly white English police department. And I just thought she was such a good character and such a good, kind of point of view character. I would really like if there's another book with Sarah in it. So that's Goddess of the North. I really, really liked that book a lot. It is, again, not out yet, but keep an eye out for it because I think that it's great. I read, this is also not out yet, another preview book, The Truth and Other Stories by Stanislav Lem. But if you know classic sci-fi, you will have heard of Stanislav Lem. This collection that's coming out called The Truth and Other Stories is new, but most of the stories that are in the collection are from the 1950s. There are a couple of more recent ones as well, but it's a collection of Stanislav Lem's short stories, and there's maybe one novella length, I would say, in there, but mostly short stories. A lot of them have to do with like human-alien first contact situations is a major theme. Technology and the kind of perils of technology is another. It's funny, actually. A lot of the stories of Stanislav Lem are quite funny, I thought. So if you're interested in classic science fiction, I would say to keep an eye out for the collection. The collection's really well organized, and they've got, dates that all the different stories were written, so you can kind of follow the trajectory of Stanislav Lem's writing as it changes a little bit. And he's someone who, a lot of his work was not translated into English, or at least not translated into English consistently or in collections, right? So I'm glad that this book is coming out because it gathers, quite a bit of his work in one place for English readers specifically. It's definitely, I read predominantly, as is obvious from this discussion, I read predominantly contemporary books. And Stanislav Lem's stories do not read as contemporary. Like, they're definitely classic science fiction. They read like they were written in the time that they were written in, but they're really they're worth a look for sure. So if you're into classic science fiction, definitely Stanislav Lem is probably somebody you've heard of. If not, do read a little something about him, and maybe it will be up your interests. 2 books left. I read The Galaxy and the Ground Within by Becky Chambers. This is the 4th book and conclusion in a series of books that I have loved. I think the second one was my favorite out of the 4. But The Galaxy and the Ground Within is a really fun book. You could easily read it without having read the other 3 because they all follow different kind of scenarios, but they're in the same universe. So this book does refer to one character who's in a prior book, but not in a way that you need to really be familiar with him to know what's going on. So you could read it as a standalone, and it follows these different aliens who have all landed on this planet because they're basically at a stopover between wormholes. So it's a planet that has all different domes on it, where travelers will kind of stop off between their turns in different wormholes and just, get some food and fuel and hang out for a bit. And so there's this kind of random assortment of aliens from different species who get stranded on this planet and have to stay there for longer than intended. And so the book kind of explores their getting to know each other. And in some cases, these aliens come from different species that maybe have a history of misunderstandings between them, or a history of prejudices between them and things like that. And it's a good one, and something that's really great about The Galaxy and the Ground Within that is, I think, unusual in science fiction writing is that there is not a human character in it at all. the vast majority of the alien characters in the book are not humanoid. Like they're not they're nothing resembling humans at all. So I really like the way that the different types of aliens are developed in the story anyway. I mean, that's true across the whole series of Becky Chambers books as well. How she explores the different and develops these different kind of alien physiologies and cultures and societies is really interesting. And it's a lot, and I will say too that series, which is called the Wayfarer series by Becky Chambers, is like it's almost like feel good science fiction. Not quite, like it's not like there's no conflict, but it's not scary. It's quite approachable. I feel like this series, the Wayfarer series, has been just like a happy place for me in a lot of ways. I really want to get it as a box set when that becomes available. But totally, I mean, I would say to read the first book in the Wayfarer series if you're interested in this series, but The Galaxy and the Ground Within can totally be read as a standalone, and I thought it was really great and fun and gentle and subtle and a great read. Finally, the last book that I read is The Once and Future Witches by Alex Harrow. This is one of the books that I mentioned that was a longer term read. I've been reading The Once and Future Witches with Corvin Green of Tail Raven Tarot, who has a book club. And so we've been meeting every other week on Zoom to talk about the book. And The Once and Future Witches takes place in the late 1800s, United States, and follows a group of sisters who are witches. And they are, again, I don't want to say too much about the plot, but they're discovering their magic, and they're also confronting both anti-witch and misogynist and anti-feminist elements in their society. It's definitely a political book for sure in the best way. And I liked the writing in The Once and Future Witches. I liked the representation, diversity in The Once and Future Witches. I liked the characters. I liked the world building. And I liked the research that went into it, because the late 1800s, early 1900s, this is a time period that I have spent a lot of time studying for my own work. So often historical fiction that is set in that time period, I will be quite critical of. But I really thought that it was really well done. Alex Harrow has a background as a historian, and it really, really shows in The Once and Future Witches in terms of how she talks about feminist movements at that time, how she talks about the kind of political climate at that time. So much of it is so well done. And we all liked The Once and Future Witches so much that right now we're reading 10,000 Doors of January, which is Alex E. Harrow's first book. Once and Future Witches was her second. So everybody in the group loved The Once and Future Witches. So I cannot recommend The Once and Future Witches enough if you like to read novels or fiction about witches. It was fantastic. So that was a really long video. Oh my goodness. Okay. Well, if you stuck with me, thank you. I really loved a lot of the books that I read this month. So I knew that this video would end up being ridiculous and long, but I wanted to make it because I like talking about books, especially like talking about books that I have completely loved, and I loved The History of My Brief Body. I loved White Tears, Brown Scars. I mean, it's a tough read, obviously, for all kinds of reasons, as it should be. It's a challenging book, right? But so excellent. The Once and Future Witches was excellent. Galaxy and the Ground Within was excellent. Goddess of the North was excellent. So I'm really happy with, while I had some books that I had some issues with this month, I also read a lot that I loved. And in the interest of time, I'm going to save picking my TBR cards for May for my next update video. So thank you so much for watching. Have a good day. I hope that everyone is well, and I will talk to y'all again soon.